This is where English America began, right here at Fort Raleigh on Roanoke Island in North Carolina. England was seeking a base in North America to counter the Spanish threat in St. Augustine, which was in what was called Spanish Florida. In 1584, Walter Raleigh and other influential men organized the first English exploration of the New World. Raleigh was granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth to colonize and claim the territory for England. Raleigh secured two ships. One was commanded by Philip Armadas and the other by Arthur Barlow. They were guided by a Portuguese pilot, Simon Ferdinando. They left England in April of 1584 and by way of the Caribbean made their way up the coast of North America to Cape Hatteras. They discovered Roanoke Island, and the natives were curious and friendly. They made contact with the Indians and then spent 6 weeks exploring the coast and the mainland and the island. In the early fall of 1584, they returned to England and took with them two local Indians, Manteo and Wanchese. Thomas Harriot was a tutor that lived on the Walter Raleigh estate. He taught the two Indians English and learned some of their language and customs. Walter Raleigh was knighted by Queen Elizabeth and given a patent for a colony in the New World, which was renamed Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen. Sir Walter Raleigh organized a larger colony expedition. It consisted of 300 men and 7 ships and was launched in April of 1585 and arrived at Roanoke Island in July. Upon arrival, the military commander, Ralegh, supervised the construction of an earthen fortress called Fort Raleigh. In addition to the 300 men, 2 important men accompanied the excursion. One was Thomas Harriot, who was a scientist, historian, and interpreter, and the other person was John White. He was the artist and surveyor for the party. Their main supply ship, the Tiger, ran aground in the Pamlico Sound, and water entered into the ship and spoiled most of their food supplies. Sir Richard Grenville, who was commander of the fleet, decided to return to England after they got the ship unstuck, and then they had a decision to make. They had to ask the Indians for food, and Manteo talked the Indians into supplying the colonists with food. So they were able to explore the area. Many of the colonists were soldiers, and they were not really interested in hunting or fishing to secure food, nor to even build shelter for themselves. They were dependent on the Indians for food during that winter. By the springtime, the Indians had grown a bit wearisome of the demands for food from the colonists, and relations with the Indians deteriorated. When the parties were out exploring different villages on the mainland and in other parts, an incident occurred. In one village, a silver cup was stolen by one of the Indians, and Ralegh, the military commander, demanded that it be returned, and it was not. So in retaliation, he killed one of the Indians and burned their village down, also their food supply. So the relations with the Indians deteriorated to a point where the colonists were quite insecure about their position. The chief of the Roanokes was named Wingina. He lived in a village across the Sound, and as the relationship deteriorated, he told his tribes not to supply food to the colonists. And this made the military commander, Ralegh, very paranoid. He was convinced that the Indians were going to attack and try to massacre the colonists. So he called for a meeting with Wingina to discuss the events. But really what he had planned was an ambush. And so when they met the Indian chief Wingina and his council, they attacked him and killed him. And then from that point on, there's food supplies for the colonists dwindled, and they were really desperate. The colonists were supposed to receive a supply ship in April from Sir Richard Grenville, who had gone back to England and was going to return with supplies and more people. However, he didn't appear. So soon after they returned to the village, they spotted a flotilla of ships offshore, and it was Sir Francis Drake. He had been on an exploration in northern climes and was headed back south to England and stopped to check on the colonists. So they were able to get supplies from him, and he offered them a ship of supplies and gave them the ship to send back to England for supplies. However, this was in June and it was hurricane season. And before they could unload the ship, a hurricane came roaring through and the ship was blown out to sea and disappeared with its crew. So they were back in their dilemma again. So Sir Francis Drake offered to take them back to England in his ships. And so they agreed to that and got on board his ships and left about a dozen soldiers there, and the rest of the 300 or so men returned to England. Well, as fate would have it, about 2 weeks after that, the supply ship that was supposed to come in April showed up after Sir Francis Drake had departed with the bulk of the personnel. And when Sir Richard Grenville arrived, there was no sign of the dozen or so soldiers that were left behind. So they decided to return to England, the third colony, 120 settlers, including 17 women and 9 children, and led by John White, the artist from the previous expedition, arrived on July 22nd. On August the 18th, a baby girl was born to the daughter of John White, named Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the New World. It was too late in the season to plant crops, so they decided that they would send the ship back to get supplies and arrive the next spring. The settlers decided that John White should return and arrange for more supplies for the spring. He reluctantly returned after an arduous journey and arrived in September of 1587, only to find that England was at war with Spain. John White's attempt to return and resupply the Virginia colony was thwarted by the hazards of war. Finally, after 2 years and 7 months, a relief excursion of 2 ships left England in March of 1590 via the Caribbean to resupply the colony in Virginia. However, after several months of delays and mishaps in the West Indies, the 2 relief ships arrived off the Outer Banks on August 15th. It had been 3 years. The supplies were offloaded to a small rowboat to navigate the inlet through the sandbanks. More bad luck occurred. A nor'easter blew up, and heavy surf capsized the small boat, drowning 4 seamen of the 11-man crew. They finally arrived at Fort Raleigh on August 18th, only to find it abandoned. The word Croatan was carved on a post as the only clue to their whereabouts. John White believed the colony had moved to Hatteras. Another bad storm prevented the 2 ships from reaching Hatteras. Low on water and supplies, they returned to England. The settlers were never found and became known as the Lost Colony.